I'm Dr. Orion Taraban, and this is PsycHacks, Better Living Through Psychology. And the topic of today's short talk is the disposable man. This episode is likely going to rub some folks the wrong way. However, I've been sitting with these ideas for quite some time, and I think they're now ready for a wider audience. The message here will be difficult for some men to hear because it may cause them to question their identities in a deep, fundamental way. Fish can't see the water. When you've been swimming in water your entire life, the element becomes invisible. On some level, it has to become invisible in order to navigate in that medium, and the properties of the water slowly become indistinguishable from the properties of the fish. Today, we're going to be discussing where the fish ends and the water begins. Most men that exist on this planet are brainwashed. I understand that word has some very serious connotations, but try as I might, I haven't been able to find a word that better describes men's predicament. It's a brainwashing that is supported in a million little ways across most cultures, and it's been going on for so long that its existence has been completely naturalized. Many people, including men, even believe that it constitutes a biological difference in much the same way that the social conditions in which women have historically operated have been mistaken for women's natural inferiority. It's such an accepted belief that when I say it out loud, it may not even provoke any surprise or astonishment. So let me first present a more visible historical contrast to bring this belief into sharper focus. During the Second World War, the Japanese military adopted the practice of the divine wind, which is the literal translation of kamikaze. Kamikaze pilots were young men who were ordered to dive bomb American battleships. They would be killed in the process, but they might also be able to kill hundreds of their enemy in one fell swoop. While they lived, kamikaze pilots were very highly honored, and their memories were celebrated with all the martial pomp the Japanese military could muster. Self-sacrifice in the service of others was established as the highest goal to which a man could attain. And who were these others? After all, it wasn't other men who were sheltered on the home front. It was women. This part doesn't get said out loud very often, but it's important to enunciate in order to logically complete the thought. Namely, self-sacrifice in the service of women was established as the highest goal to which a man could attain. Now, if you heard that last sentence and didn't think there was anything strange about it, let me ask you a follow-up question. Do you think the kamikaze pilots were brainwashed? That is, if you took away the propaganda and the indoctrination and the pomp and the honor and the glory, do you think that a healthy, functioning man would volunteer to throw his life away? And if it was voluntary, why would all the propaganda and indoctrination and pomp have been necessary? Survival is kind of the ultimate goal of all living things. To suggest that an individual would voluntarily surrender that goal, despite the protoplasmic desire of every cell in his body to continue living, without the presence of some overarching ideology, patriotism, love, freedom, the right thing to do, is a bridge too far. And of course, it's easier for us Westerners to consider the kamikaze indoctrination to be brainwashing because we don't share those cultural beliefs. It seems foreign and alien to us, but it probably wouldn't have to the Japanese at the time. And that, in turn, implies the existence of beliefs that seem perfectly reasonable to us that might be baffling and incomprehensible to those who do not share those beliefs. However, as we'll see, the more things change, the more things stay the same. In point of fact, men today are still raised to imitate the divine wind. This is the belief under which most men are brainwashed, that men are most useful as sacrifices. And the larger the sacrifice, the more useful they are considered to be. This means that culture, in a million insidious ways, programs men to die, or at least to be willing to die when necessary, so that their sacrifice might be useful to others, and in particular, to women. To my mind, this, by itself, is a large part of why far more men commit suicide than women do. From a very young age, men are groomed for self-sacrifice in a way that women, who are instead instructed in their inherent value, just aren't. And a society in which one gender is systematically programmed to sacrifice for the good of the other, in my opinion, can't possibly be just and can't possibly be equal. Just imagine how different the world would look if young boys were taught that they had inherent worth and that their incurring harm, physical or emotional, is one of the most heinous transgressions that could occur in society. That they had a right to their lives and that they weren't bound to do the right thing when the right thing conflicted with the right thing for them. And that they had an entitlement to service and protection from women simply on the basis of their gender. Trust me, the most destabilizing revolution in human history will occur precisely 25 years after we stop programming boys with the kamikaze script. Let's be clear. The kamikaze comparison is both literal and figurative. Today, at this very moment, men are being sent to war to die. To die for causes that they may not understand and for reasons from which they cannot possibly benefit. In this country, men are forced to enroll in selective service. A lot of American women don't even know that this program exists, but it doesn't seem to bother anyone, men or women. Why? Because we all just kind of believe that, yeah, men are the disposable sex. They're expendable. Like, I wonder how many fewer wars we would collectively have fought throughout history if the belligerents were forced to send women, that is the valued sex, into battle. Like, suddenly the conflict might not be so worth it, you know? However, men are also and more commonly expected to make a figurative self-sacrifice in the service of women. This has to do with giving up on his hopes, his dreams, his interests, his friends, his happiness, and the possibility of happiness, if and when any of these things conflict with his duty to his woman. They are told to grow up, man up, and step up, not when action would be in their own self-interest, but when action would be beneficial to the interests of a woman with whom he is in a relationship. That women are in some way entitled to men's wealth. And this is problematic because believing that one is entitled to another person's wealth is equivalent to believing that one is entitled to the labor that created that wealth. And believing that one is entitled to another person's labor is slavery. It's a partial slavery, to be sure, because it's proportional and indirect, which is why it can functionally operate in plain sight. But I would argue that slavery is so abominable that even partial forms of it should be called out. Now, when this episode goes public, I expect some measure of pushback from the audience. And frankly, I'm going to expect that most of the pushback that I receive will not come from women, but from men. This is because there is a not insignificant subset of men that has so deeply identified with this programming that it has been elevated to the status of an ideal. Sacrifice in the service of women, an ideal that is ingrained in the romantic imagination, is not just a duty for these men, it's a source of pride. And the more they sacrifice, the more they feel entitled to feel proud of themselves. And I would argue that this is because these men suffer from a kind of Stockholm syndrome. They have not been able to escape this captive ideology, so they have imbued it with positive, even holy, i.e. divine wind, attributes. Not only that, but for every man who believes that his self-sacrifice in the service of women is a source of pride, there is another man who is currently despairing because he has no woman to whom to offer his life as sacrifice. That's how deep this programming is. There are men right now, who are depressed, hopeless, and self-loathing because they do not yet have a beneficiary for his impulse to self-sacrifice. They are soldiers in want of a war. And I don't think we can say the same of the opposite sex. Now, this is not about demanding that women be kamikaze pilots as well. I don't want there to be any kamikaze pilots. Like, I would prefer that that role doesn't exist. That said, there are times when a person has to be willing to lay it on the line and to back up one's position with sweat and blood. Otherwise, how much do I truly value my values? However, if I'm going to do that, if I'm going to go all in, I'm going to do so in the service of my dreams and my values and my ideals, not for somebody else's. I reserve that right to myself. Another person's distress is not necessarily my responsibility. To demonstrate how reasonable men suddenly become with respect to this idea, just swap the gender of the person who happens to be in distress. Like, it's possible that I would die to protect Kyle from the other side of town, but before I did so, I would have some questions. Questions like, what did Kyle do to get himself involved in such a dangerous predicament? Why isn't Kyle able to protect himself? What would I hope to gain from fighting his battles? And why do I feel motivated to protect Kyle from the consequences of his decisions? What's more, I don't think I would feel particularly guilty for not getting involved in Kyle's situation, depending on the answers to those questions. However, turn Kyle into Carla, and the situation feels much different. Throw the possibility of honor into the mix, and you're off to the races. In my estimation, that kind of high-sounding language is poor recompense for a life cut short. In any case, when men do feel guilty for not getting involved, when, like Cain, they feel ashamed that their sacrifice has been rejected by women as insufficient, that's the programming speaking. And the solution is for men to recognize it as such and to turn away from death and sacrifice and toward life and abundance and prosperity. Like, I am going to take the radical position that my life is no less valuable than a woman's, or that my hopes and dreams are any less valuable than a woman's. I like my life. I really do. I want to live a long and happy and healthy life. I am not convinced, simply as an accident of my birth, that I should be a vessel of self-sacrifice for the other gender. Furthermore, I'm going to argue what most women implicitly understand, namely that a life without honor, which is not the same thing as a life with dishonor, that a life without honor is preferable to a death with honor. Life, my brothers, is a precious thing. And I would argue that the life of a man, literally or figuratively, is not any less precious on the basis of his gender. There will be more peace and justice and equality in the world the more this is accepted as true. And as I said, this might be a tough sell for men because men like honor. Men like glory. So do I. However, my argument is that these words are too often used like bullfighters' capes. They lead men right into the sword. For instance, many men would proudly die for their women. That is no small thing. But just how many of these men would live for them? Like, how many of these men are healthy and they take care of themselves so that they can live for as long as possible, that they can have as many resources and be abundant and share with the women in their lives? How many of them are focused on that versus sacrificing what they currently have? As courageous as it is to die in the service of an ideal, it is often much harder to live in the service of that same ideal. And what these men might be escaping through their sacrifice is an invitation to an even higher calling, an invitation not to death, but to life. To be healthy and virtuous and strong and powerful and abundant and prosperous. Like, these are classical virtues, the kind of virtues that existed before Christianity, which functionally argues, through the example of Christ, that self-sacrifice in the service of others is the highest ideal to which men can attain. My point in closing is not that this is entirely wrong. That's a very good thing. My point is that this ideal can be so easily exploited by others, and that men should be very clear about what exactly they are sacrificing and why. Life demands more than death. It's often the harder choice, which is why men can be so loath to choose it.